Two phones, side by side. One is being sold on the promise of world's first 140x ultra zoom. The other tops out at 40x. Basic math says this should be a massacre. So someone runs the comparison. They zoom in, all the way, and the phone with 140x zoom, the flagship, the headline feature, the thing they built an entire launch event around, just looks worse. Objectively, measurably, embarrassingly worse. Nobody hacked the footage. Nobody cherry-picked the shot. The company just marketed that to millions of people and charged them for it.
And when it comes to phone cameras, what mostly matters is sensor size. The bigger the sensor, the more light and the more real detail that your shots have. What most companies spend far more time talking about is resolution, which beyond a certain point doesn't matter at all on a phone. Like, the last 4 generations of Samsung phones have had a 200 megapixel resolution. They're still shooting their actual photos in 12. And don't even get me started on maximum zoom magnification. Look at this page for the Nothing Phone 4a Pro. The headline feature, the #1 thing being used to sell this phone, is world's first 140 times ultra zoom. Oh my goodness. I mean, my iPhone only has 40 times max zoom, so it's gonna get cooked, right? Okay, zoom all the way to 40 times on the iPhone, 40 times on the Nothing. Oh my god. Right, yeah, so it's exactly what we expected. The Nothing phone, regardless of whether you use the AI enhancement or not, just looks worse. It's just not capturing as much information as the iPhone, and AI can't help you there. Let me make something very clear. How far your phone can digital zoom has literally zero correlation with how good of a camera it is. What it actually does correlate with, though, is how low a company's standards are for what counts as a photo. Damn. Because I could literally go back to the first smartphone I ever owned if I wanted, take a photo, and just keep cropping in till all I can see is a single brown smudge, and technically, that could be 300 times digital zoom. Best zoom camera in the world, everyone. Oh my god. I can't do this anymore.
The tech industry used to have a clean deal with its customers. Simple, honest. A new product comes out, and it tells you exactly how much better it is than the last one. Not a range, not a ceiling, a number. This chip is 23% faster. This battery lasts 4 more hours. This camera resolves 40% more detail. That was the contract. And it worked. Because for a long time, the improvements were real enough to report accurately. Apple's M1 chip, released in 2020, genuinely stunned the industry. Independent benchmarks matched the marketing claims. Samsung's Galaxy S series camera improvements in the early 2020s were measurable, demonstrable, photographable. The products earned the headlines. At the peak of this era, consumers trusted spec sheets. Tech journalism ran comparison benchmarks because the numbers meant something. The entire consumer electronics market, worth over $1 trillion globally, ran on the implicit promise that when a company printed a number on a product page, that number was real. That was the height. And the fall from it is almost impressive in its own right. It's the glitched system. And this is why every spec on that page is a lie. The tech marketing machine didn't become dishonest overnight. It evolved. And in the early stages, it was actually sophisticated. Apple's Get a Mac campaign, 2006 through 2009, was comparative advertising at its most honest. Specific claims. Side-by-side demonstrations. Real differences that real users could verify. Then something shifted around the early 2010s. Products got good enough that marginal improvements became hard to communicate without context. And the marketing teams, facing the pressure of annual release cycles and shareholder expectations, found a solution. Not better products, better language. Up to 2 words, 6 characters, unlimited legal protection. By 2015, up to X% faster had become the industry standard across every major platform. Apple, Samsung, Intel, Qualcomm. The phrase wasn't a hedge, it was a strategy. Because mathematically, up to a billion includes 0. The spec is technically unchallengeable. And unchallengeable is very valuable when your actual improvement is 7%.
And I feel like we have to start with the magic new catch-all term of the tech industry, up to. What we need to see, and what we used to see a lot more of, is this new product is X% better than the last one. This very simple idea basically doesn't exist anymore. Practically every single tech company quotes every single change as up to.
Up to 2 times faster. Gets up to 8 more hours.
Is up to 2 times faster.
You'll notice they don't even write it as up to a lot of the time. They'll just like mutter it quickly under their breath, like it's some sort of pedantic footnote that you don't need to pay attention to. But if you think about it, any stat that starts with an up to doesn't mean anything. I could say this video is going to reach up to 1 billion people, and if it only ends up reaching my parents and then like one cousin in India, I was still right. And you could argue, well, you know, workloads are more complex now. It's harder to estimate exactly how much better something is. But the real reason this is being used is very clear. It's to be able to stick a massive number on your web page and not be sued for it. So if you see up to followed by a percentage improvement, honestly, just disregard it and go search up specifically how much better that product is in exactly what you're planning on doing with it. The one that I find much tougher is what I would call the efficiency improvement trap. And it's a specific problem with the way that performance improvements are sold to us. Every year, we hear a very similar story.
Performance-wise, we're seeing a 23% boost and 20% more efficiency too.
So even just ignoring for a second how they slipped in that little up to behind him, even though he didn't actually say it, this guy is very clearly implying that this chip lets you game with about 20% faster performance while your battery lasts 20% longer.
So not only you're getting smoother gameplay, but you're also getting better battery life while doing it.
But the important thing to understand is you don't get both. If your efficiency goes up by 20%, but then you're using all of that extra efficiency to get this 20% extra performance, then what you're actually getting is the same battery life. So when you then bundle that back in with the fact that the entire thing is only up to 23% faster and up to 20% more efficient, and what we're really often talking about in these kinds of situations is an average expected improvement of like 5% to your performance and your end battery life.
The companies knew exactly what they were doing. The language was precise by design. Samsung, at the Galaxy S24 launch event, stood on stage and said this: "Our partnership continues to go strong as we create new ways to do more with Google on Galaxy devices." They spent a significant portion of their flagship launch event presenting Circle to Search, framed as a revolutionary Galaxy-exclusive innovation made possible by this deep, special partnership. The crowd applauded. The headlines wrote themselves. Circle to Search also shipped on Xiaomi phones. It was a Google feature. Samsung was the first to show it, that's all. The cracks were always there for anyone paying attention. Refresh rates marketed as motion rates. RAM rebranded as unified memory. Storage upgrades that cost $200 more while the cheaper tier quietly disappeared. Small things, easy to rationalize.
And if you thought that companies exaggerating their specs to seem better than others is a problem, then how about when companies just invent entirely new specs so that you can't even compare them to others? When companies start to build loyalty, they want to be able to charge more for the same stuff. But how do you get away with that in a world where a comparison is just one quick ChatGPT search away? Well, make it so confusing for customers to compare you that the easiest thing then becomes for them to just take your word for it that you're better. One of the most prolific examples of this right now is RAM. Any computer, any phone, any laptop, even your smartwatch needs RAM to be able to juggle tasks. And this is true no matter which company's product it is. But Apple now refers to their RAM almost exclusively as unified memory. They can say this because their RAM is actually part of their chip as opposed to a separate component, which does make that RAM a little more efficient in some ways. But it glosses over a very important detail, that Windows laptops often have dedicated graphics cards that have their own additional pool of RAM, whereas unified memory means that both the CPU and the GPU share from one small pool. So you're pretty much always getting less RAM. And yeah, I mean, Apple executives have famously boasted about how their unified memory is so efficient that just 8 GB of it is equivalent to 16 gigs on Windows, but it's not really true. There just will be a hard cap on how much multitasking you're able to do, because 8 gigs is 8 gigs. But even so, can you see how this whole concept of unified memory still helps Apple? It makes something as simple as RAM feel like some sort of grey area, which means they can give you a lot less of it, and they can charge you more to upgrade it than any other company.
Hard to pattern match in real time. And then someone did the math. The crack isn't a scandal. It's a logic problem. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Any statistic prefaced with up to is mathematically meaningless. That's not hyperbole, that's arithmetic. Up to 8x faster includes 1x faster. It includes 0.1x faster. It includes no change at all. The maximum describes a ceiling that may never be reached under any real-world condition the buyer will ever encounter. The script illustration is almost too clean. I can say this video is going to reach up to 1 billion people. And if it only reaches my parents and one cousin in India, I was still right. The audience's reaction to that line, across YouTube comments, across Reddit threads, across tech forums, was immediate and unanimous. I will never read a spec sheet the same way. This is genuinely illegal and nobody is doing anything about it. Up to means nothing. I feel so stupid for not seeing this. That's not just engagement. That's the sound of a belief system cracking. Before, consumers assumed up to 8x faster meant their experience would be meaningfully, measurably faster. After, they understood they'd been handed a number with no floor, legally designed to be unverifiable. Forward pull line, but up to was just the entry point. Because once the industry learned that language could replace reality, it didn't stop at adverbs. The up to problem is linguistic. What comes next is structural. Companies began combining specs from different product configurations, maximum performance numbers alongside minimum starting prices, to create specifications that described a product that simply did not exist for sale at that price point. Rivian's R1T page, 420 miles of range. 0 to 60 in under 2.5 seconds. Starting under $74,000. 3 impressive numbers. One problem. The model with 420 miles of range does 0 to 60 in 3.4 seconds. The 2.5 second version costs $30,000 more and has 40 fewer miles of range. And for $73,000 you get neither. The spec sheet was describing a truck that didn't exist. Comments under Rivian's product page around this period. I spent 3 hours trying to configure the truck I saw in the ad. It doesn't exist. That's not confusion. That's by design. The language trick evolved.
In announcement keynotes, and a lot of advertising specifically, a lot of companies like to do this thing where they combine a bunch of different specs from different versions of the same product into one page, creating what I like to call the imaginary spec. So like one of the most common versions you'll see is a company will put like the maximum up to performance number alongside the minimum starting at price. And they'll put them next to each other in a product where you can't actually get the maximum performance for the minimum price. Here's Rivian, for example, on the R1T website. You'll see, wow, 420 miles of range and a 0 to 60 in under 2.5 seconds, starting at under $74,000. But not exactly, because the one with 420 miles of range is the dual motor, which has a 3.4 second 0 to 60. Still quick, but the 2.5 second version costs $30,000 more and has 40 miles less range. And for $73,000, you don't get either of those things. So yeah, this here is an imaginary spec. Oh, and by the way, that's another one while we're at it, EV range claims. Now there are laws around how accurate your range claims actually have to be, just like with gas mileage, and some companies are a little more optimistic about that range claim than others, fine, but the fact is we are still pretty early in this battery tech, and the tiniest, even seemingly insignificant things can make a pretty significant difference to your range. And so even when you break it all the way down to specific Rivian models, the one that does the 2.5 second 0 to 60, you can see that 374 mile range claim right here. Well, when you actually click in, that's when you realize that's on a specific wheel with a specially designed sticky Michelin tire And then, oh, look at that. You're actually getting 338 miles of range. You'll have to switch down to the standard sport wheel and tire to get the 374 miles of estimated range. So yes, even this here was an imaginary spec. And I promise you, Rivian is far from the only offender in the world of cars.
Now, they weren't just hedging numbers. They were building fictional products. If imaginary specs confused buyers within a product line, invented specs eliminated comparison altogether. Apple's unified memory, Hisense's motion rate 120, Samsung's QLED, LG's QNED. None of these describe what you think they describe. Unified memory is RAM, but rebranded to obscure the fact that Apple's CPU and GPU share a single, often smaller pool. Motion rate 120 is not a 120 Hz refresh rate. It's motion smoothing software with a number attached. QLED and QNED are LCD panels engineered to visually approximate OLED in marketing materials. The most efficient version of this. When a consumer tells a less tech-savvy friend, make sure it has OLED, and the friend comes home with a QLED, the company succeeded. Confusion is the product. The invented spec is a competitive moat built out of language. This is where the staircase gets steep. A 1-inch camera sensor is not 1 inch in any dimension. A 1.5K display has no axis measuring 1,500 pixels. These aren't rounding errors or marketing spin. They are measurements borrowed from technologies that no longer exist, applied to modern products because the legacy terminology sounds more impressive than the accurate one.
You're not convinced, all right? Maybe you're watching this thinking, you know, it's fine if they make up specs as long as they're technically true, but I'll do you one better. What if there's made up specs that are actually numerically, factually false? I actually made an entire separate video all about this, but 1-inch camera sensors are not 1 inch in any dimension. And 1.5K displays are actually not 1500 pixels in any dimension either. How is that possible? Well, it's because the way we measure things has changed. Like something like this camera, for example. This is a Sony ZV-1. A lot of cameras like it. This camera has a 1-inch sensor. It says so on their website. And that sounds amazing. A 1-inch sensor in this little camera? Have you ever looked inside like a pro DSLR or mirrorless camera at the size of that sensor? That looks like about a 1-inch sensor. So this must also have a huge sensor like that. But it's not. It's way smaller. Why is that? Well, turns out this is a 1-inch sensor because in 2026, that's what we call a 1-inch type sensor. See, before digital cameras didn't have sensors at all. They actually used vacuum tubes. And so the size of the tube was actually what they measured. So a 1-inch vacuum tube would create an image area inside it closer to about 16 millimeters diagonally. And that is actually about the size of the 1-inch type sensor in this camera. So it's 2026, but we're calling this a 1-inch sensor because that is the size of the theoretical vacuum tube that would be required to produce an image the size of this sensor. Why? Turns out 1-inch sensor is a marketing name more than it is an actual measurement. And I have the same beef with displays, because you've probably already heard a lot of smartphones recently have like 1.5K displays. You've heard this? You've seen a lot of these floating around? But none of them have 1500 pixel measurements. So what's going on here? See, this is where it gets weird. Okay, so intuitively we all agree that 4K, for example, is referring to the horizontal resolution, right? So this video is 4K because it's 4,000 pixels across, roughly. It's 4096 by 2048. Sometimes it's 3840 by 2160, but it's roughly 4,000 pixels wide. And 8K would be 8,000 pixels wide. But at some point, for some reason, we started calling 2560 by 1440 2K, which is close, but a little bit off. And then for some reason, 1080p, which is now referring to the vertical resolution, is 1K, which is weird because 1080p is actually 1920 by 1080. So it should be 2K, but now we're calling 1080p 1K. And so now smartphone companies are using 1.5K to refer to a measurement somewhere in between 1080p and 1440p. So it's not actually 1500 across or 1500 tall. It just means somewhere in between 1K and 2K. And that's super annoying to me, but it's how we talk now.
The 1-inch sensor specification descends from vacuum tube cameras. The measurement described the tube required to produce a particular image area, not the sensor itself. The tube doesn't exist. The inch isn't real. The number on the spec sheet is a ghost measurement from 1950s hardware, still haunting 2026 product pages. Greek chorus, the comment that broke through on this segment. So we've been comparing sensors using a unit from technology that doesn't exist anymore, and everyone just agreed to keep doing it? The answer is yes, because 1-inch sounds better than 16 millimeters diagonal. Transition to peak. But there's one moment where all of this, the invented specs, the ghost measurements, the fictional configurations, collapses into a single, undeniable image. And it happened live. Nothing Phone markets the 4A Pro's headline feature as the world's first 140x ultra zoom. At a product level, that's 3.5 times the zoom of a standard iPhone. On paper, it's not close. Someone ran the comparison on camera. iPhone at 40x. Nothing Phone at 40x. Then at 140x. The verdict was immediate and visual. The Nothing Phone at any zoom level captured less information. The AI enhancement didn't close the gap. The headline feature, the number they led with, the thing they put on the box, produced objectively worse photographs than a competitor with less than a third of the zoom. The comment that captured it, 140x zoom on a smudge is still a smudge. Digital zoom has zero correlation with camera quality. What it does correlate with is how low a company's standards are for what counts as a photo. The tech industry's deception isn't the story of bad actors. It's the story of what happens when an industry's real-world improvement rate can no longer keep pace with its marketing ambition. The products are still good. In many cases, genuinely impressive. But genuinely impressive doesn't move units at a 20% price increase. Spectacular numbers do. And when the reality stops supplying spectacular numbers, the language takes over. Every up to, every invented spec, every ghost measurement, every old product comparison that manufactures an 8x improvement from a 7% one. These aren't anomalies. They're infrastructure. The entire consumer electronics marketing machine has been quietly rebuilt around the management of perception, not the reporting of truth. The companies aren't lying because they're uniquely corrupt. They're lying because the alternative honesty about marginal gains doesn't convert. Samsung stood on stage and told you their revolutionary partnership with Google was creating exclusive new experiences for Galaxy users. That feature shipped on Xiaomi the same week. They said the quiet part on a live stream in front of millions of people. And the headlines still wrote it as innovation. Tech companies didn't run out of innovation. They ran out of honesty. As always, it's the glitched system, and I want to thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Peace.
So speaking of phone cameras, last but not least is the classic shot on a smartphone trope. First of all, several companies have already been caught lying about like sample images that were supposed to be shot on that smartphone that were just licensed from some professional photo shoot somewhere on a random DSLR, which is already crazy. But even the ones that aren't lying do feel like they're kind of stretching the truth with the amount of extra hardware that's being added to shoot it on a smartphone. Like the whole point, I feel like, of this, awesome piece of content was shot on a smartphone is to sort of inspire and empower you to shoot your own awesome photos and videos with that tiny sensor and lens that fits in your pocket everywhere you go. But when there's a massive external stabilization rig and huge lenses and filters and all sorts of other things added to the phone and millions of dollars of lighting and set design to make that all possible, I guess it's still impressive, but it also kind of defeats the purpose a little bit. I can almost guarantee there are features disabled on those phones to make those accessories work. Like if I'm shooting with all that stuff, I'm disabling the built-in stabilization if I have a 5-figure jib to shoot with. Like if the only thing from the original phone that you're still using to shoot is just the sensor technically, then is it still shot on a smartphone? I guess technically yes, but I'm now actually way less impressed.